All right, we are recording. We are live streaming on Facebook. So if you want to share the video now or look for it later, go to facebook.com/BUDPR, and we are recording to share this on our website and YouTube page later. But welcome everyone to who's here with us on Zoom and watching on Facebook Live to today's event on the news media, crises, and colonialism in Puerto Rico with Professor Federico Subervi. Let me introduce myself and say a little bit about BUDPR organization. My name is Alberto Medina. I'm one of the leaders and board members of Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora. I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico, but now based in Colorado. And I've been working in the communications field for the past decade or so. And before that, briefly worked at newspapers in Puerto Rico. So I'm really excited to be your moderator for this conversation. Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora, or BUDPR, as we affectionately call it, is an advocacy organization of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. Who are fighting for the decolonization of Puerto Rico and for a free, fair, prosperous future for our homeland. We do a lot of work engaging with lawmakers in Washington, D.C., and in our own communities in the diaspora on issues that affect Puerto Rico. And we participate in campaigns with partners here in the US and on the archipelago, like the Puerto Rico No Se Vende campaign against displacement, with other advocacy organizations. But a big part of our work is educating, informing, and engaging the Puerto Rican diaspora and other potential allies in the US about the impact of colonialism in Puerto Rico so they can take action. That work often takes the form of creating a bridge, as we say, between the archipelago and the diaspora, especially helping people here in the US understand, what's happening back home. So that's the purpose of our education and engagement event series, which we're excited to kick off today. And we'll be announcing a couple more events soon, so stay tuned. We'll be having events in both Spanish and English. Today's event is in English, depending on the topic and the speaker, so stay tuned for more of that. We wanted to kick off this event series with talking about the media because, of course, it's the lens through which many of us are able to find out about and to hopefully understand information about what's happening in Puerto Rico, about politics and the issues that affect us all. So understanding, what the way that lens works is critical to understanding the issues themselves. And there's no better person to bring some insights onto this topic than our guest today. So let me introduce him briefly. Dr. Federico Subervi Velez is a Boricua from San Germán. He currently holds the position of an honorary fellow of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is the co-editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Communication, Race, and Ethnicity. He has served as a professor at 4 US universities and as a visiting professor at several other universities in Latin America and Europe. He has authored and edited 3 books and dozens of book chapters, articles, and reports, including both English and Spanish versions of a book that in large part we'll be discussing today on the news media and colonialism in Puerto Rico. His next book coming up, edited with 2 colleagues in Puerto Rico, is about political communication on the archipelago. And from his home in Austin, Texas, he is also working with an organization called Boricuas Media to provide news and information options for the Puerto Rican population in Florida. So, Dr. Subervi, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. All right, we have you. Can you hear us? Oh, I think you're muted.
I don't know why the button had been muted, the speaker. Buenas tardes. Buenas tardes. Thank you for the invitation. We're all here.
Great. Well, let's get started. I'm going to ask some questions for a little bit, and then we'll open it up in the last 10-15 minutes for anybody else who'd like to ask some questions. So the news media landscape, give us a sense of what that even looks like in Puerto Rico, and for people who may live in the U.S., how would you say it compares to, for example, the media landscape in a comparable state in terms of the number, the quality, and the diversity of news media outlets in Puerto Rico?
Well, we cannot deny that Puerto Rico, everybody knows everybody, and that's certainly the case in politics and media. So almost anybody who's in media today has been involved in politics, at least at some way or another, and anybody who's involved in politics has tried to get some input into the media. And that's more so in Puerto Rico because of the closeness of the population and the ties for many years, and that's not something that's not new. That has been going on for eons in Puerto Rico. And the next book on political communication has some particular chapter, and the book by Wilda Rodriguez will document that even more so for the press and politics, how they've been interconnected. Now, there's no problem with that except what's not stated in the media. And what's not stated, what's not covered is the issues that might affect those who are close to those politicians, to those journalists. So what we'll hear and we'll see in Puerto Rico, probably, although I haven't done a content analysis to demonstrate that, to state that with authority, there is a tendency to hold back on what is said and what is not said to the convenience of the politicians who are closely tied to the decision makers in those news media. That's a particular case in comparison to other locations where there's a greater distance between the journalists themselves and the politicians. It's not that they don't know each other and they don't interact, but there's a greater distance. And in Puerto Rico, there's a proximity that leads to, we call it sometimes, there's a convenience that is not illegal, but it's not ethical either in some of the ways that some stories and issues are presented. Someone has their microphone on that should not, and there's background noise that's interrupting this conversation right now. Thank you for whoever did that. So that's a quick answer to that. There's a lot more to it if we were to do if you read the book and you see the history of the media and the connections, you'll see a lot more detail than what I've just stated in a few minutes.
Thank you. Yes, and we'll definitely share the titles and links to where people can acquire the books. So it looks like what I'm hearing you say is that it may not necessarily be easy for someone to get good, quote unquote, objective news in Puerto Rico. Would you agree with that? And what do you think that has meant historically for reporting on Puerto Rican politics, and as it relates to the status issue specifically? How have those challenges affected the nature of the public debate on these issues?
Well, let's clarify one of the first points you just made. There is objectivity in lots of news, meaning objectivity in the sense that there's different sides to a story, and journalists are supposed to, and they really try to present those. Now, when it comes to political news that have to deal with inappropriate actions by those in government or those trying to seek positions, that's where the connections between the politicians and the journalists taints, oftentimes, not because of what is said, but sometimes because of what is not said in those news stories that should have been said. Because you cannot tell me, and I mean, I'm not doing content analysis of media in Puerto Rico or doing in-depth interviews every day to find out these things, but you cannot tell me that all of these cases of corruption were not known by some journalists or some decision makers in the journalists, or everything that we've heard left and right about the corruption. There's the untold secrets that they know. Mira, fulano, they did something. Fulano, este otro. There's y qué está pasando. That's going on, but it's not reported. And if it's reported, it's certainly not going to be the headline until the FBI comes in and raids and arrests those folks. And now it's a headline. But wait a minute, is that just really new? You didn't know that? Well, I think lots of journalists and others who are in the community know about these issues, but they're not presented with the priority and the prominence they should have because of those connections that I was talking about earlier. And so, when answering the second part,
sure,
how does that affect the discussions about status? There's a preference among the decision makers of what Puerto Rico should be. A colony of the United States with a different name. So the news that contradict that preferred condition by these decision makers are not going to be the most prominent news items. And anybody could do a content analysis and find out that the stories that would contradict the colonial status are not the most important stories that are in the headlines or repeated most often unless there's a crisis. And even when the Supreme Court has made statements again and decisions again and again against the Estado Libre Asociado, because it is a colonial, and all of the reivindications that are wanted for the ELA are just squashed. How many times do those stories get the prominent discussion in the headline day after day after day to get that across? Still, there's so many people believe that there is a possibility for enhancing the Estado Libre Asociado, and it's not going to be the case, because it's under U.S. jurisdiction and the Congress, and the Congress is not going to relinquish its powers for this political party that's been out of power for quite a few years now, but still many of its people are in power in different ways and corrupt. They're not going to relinquish those powers to the Partido Popular Democrático. And for the statehood, well, we know the answer there. There's no interest in having Puerto Rico as a state. Sadly, there's also no interest in having Puerto Rico as a sovereign nation because of the fears of the cuco de siempre, the communism. So status quo.
Well, it's interesting to hear you frame the status quo as the sort of dominant option for a lot of media, and I'm sure corporate media especially, because I've observed an interesting dynamic in which you'll have pro-statehood Puerto Ricans claim that the media is completely left-wing and pro-independence, and then you'll have pro-independence Puerto Ricans claim that the media is right-wing and perhaps even pro-statehood. But it sounds like what you're saying is that both of those sides are wrong, and the media is really in favor of maintaining a status quo that they may, benefit from politically and economically.
If I were to do a content analysis, I would find that most of the news headlines, the editorials, the opinion columns are not for independence, absolutely not. And they are more for maintaining the stability that these people believe is necessary for their benefit in their corporations and the business people. The stability is what they're looking for, and the stability is going to be maintained with the current status quo. That's my interpretation. Now, the people who say that the media are leftist, it's because anytime there's so much corruption going on, and anytime the news stories are about that corruption, about the failures of El Estado Libre Asociado, about the failures of the Partido Nuevo Progresista getting what they want for statehood in Congress, and those are headlines, at least for a day. Now, those who are in favor of of statehood will be claiming, look, these are these left-wing people. Well, it's the story of the reality when these things come out. But there's another part of the equation here, is that even the most pro-statehood people are very cultural, in terms of culture, very nationalist. And in sports, there's no need to even talk about that. Everybody in Puerto Rico, even the statehooders, are very nationalist when it comes to sports. So headlining the nationalist fervor in culture and in sports is considered by those ultra right-wingers as saying, oh, the media are left-wing. But it's not the case when it comes to talking about who controls the economic powers, the decisions in Congress, the laws that are passed. They're not left-wing, absolutely not. And we could do content analysis and document that the media are not left-wing when it comes to politics and economics.
So zooming out a little bit, beyond the specific viewpoint that a media outlet may promote or oppose, or the voices that they may include or exclude, you in the title of your book, right, the word colonialism is there as presumably as a major factor in just the entire landscape. How do you think it has affected kind of the landscape of media in Puerto Rico, our colonial status? How might it have been different, right? Or if outside of colonialism, and in what ways, beyond what you've already described, do you think it shapes the news that Puerto Ricans see or don't see? For example, in a independent Puerto Rico, or even as a state, do you think we would see more independent media? Do you think we would see a different relationship between the media and the politicians?
In small communities, the relationship is going to be tight regardless of political ideologies, because people they go to school together. They have businesses together. Their cousin, their prima, their tío, their compadre know politicians and or journalists or vice versa. So there is that connection in small communities, regardless of where you may be. Now, the key question here is, well, how different would Puerto Rico have been if from the 1930s, the FBI, well, I'm not sure it was the FBI back then, but certainly the U.S. government and the Puerto Rican government would not have suppressed the pro-independence voices in the media. If they would not have burned the radio station that had a pro-independence voice in Mayagüez, if they would not have burned el Movimiento Pro Independencia press in 1970 something, I believe it was, if the journalists who were promoting their news media and their different voices on radio would not have been fired or excluded in these voices, a lot more people would have a different interpretation of the possibilities of the future of Puerto Rico. But those repressions for decades and decades, and even today, have an impact on how much people know about different options for their politics and their economics. What has broken through that repression has been sports and culture, with the musicians, with the music, with the beauty pageants. That has broken the constraints of the censorship, explicit or implicit, by the government, US and Puerto Rico, and those political forces that want the status quo. That has broken through them, at least for a while, in a certain way. But when it comes to decisions about what are the options for improving the economy, what are the decisions for improving the education system, what are the options for improving the health system, for the environment, the most progressive voices have been silenced or limited or censored or self-censored by the journalists who don't want to get fired if they give too much voice to the critical view of the government. Now, the scenarios have changed with the social media and all of the alternatives beyond El Nuevo Día, El Vocero, WAPA, WKQ, because now there are many other ways to get some of these messages across, but still the dominant media have a major voice in the middle ground people who don't attend to these alternative views, who are very much stuck on what they heard for the previous 20, 30 years of their lives, and are still concerned about anything that is different from what they're used to is a threat to their security. And they don't know the alternatives for a more solid economics, sovereign Puerto Rico, which is possible.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like the other thing that has helped break through, at least in the last few years, and it's the other part of the title of your book, is crisis, right? Puerto Rico has had a series of crises in the last few years. We can talk about Hurricane Maria, of course, the financial and debt crisis, the ongoing corruption, crises, which you also mentioned, and the ouster of Ricardo Rosselló. And it does seem like some of those things have, shifted public debate and shifted people's perceptions about some of these issues. Do you think the media in Puerto Rico has done a good job at covering these crises, or in some cases may it have even contributed to some of them? Obviously, you mentioned already the links with the corruption, but yeah, do you feel like we're in sort of a new era because of these crises and how the media has treated them?
The answer is yes for the alternative media, not necessarily so for the traditional media that are still very much rooted in their traditional ways of reporting power, whoever is in power. They're going to be the beneficiaries of the main headlines, of the main interpretations, of the main news stories. They're going to be those people in power or aspiring to power among the main traditional lines will be the main sources for news, because that's the way that they create news. The people in power, whoever's been elected, or people who are aspiring that have some prominent position, those are the sources that the journalists will use. If they give a lot more space time or words to critical views, you get the pushback from another part of this equation that we'll be talking about maybe in a few minutes about from advertisers, who are the ones that really want to maintain the status quo as long as their profits are increasing. So alternative media don't depend on those advertisers as much, and they're a lot more critical, and that has changed the landscape. And there are numerous alternative media voices compared to what there were 2015, 5 years ago. And I have to give a plug to my colleague Sandra Rodriguez Cotto, co-author, second author of the book, who has been probably the only person in all of Puerto Rico who has systematically documented the ownership of the media, the power plays within the media, how there are connections and these, I call them in English, amicable relationships between English and between journalists and politicians. We have a different name for contubernio is the word that we use in the book in Spanish, which is again that not illegal but not ethical ties. So alternative media don't have to deal with that, or at least not most of them, I should say. People who are attending these alternative media have a different perspective on what's going on in Puerto Rican politics and Puerto Rican economics. And if you listen to at least I don't listen too much to radio from Puerto Rico, but I do listen on occasion to a couple of the programs from WPAB, yeah, in Ponce. And they have their Palabra Libre, and they have Sandra, and they have the program before and the program after. These are critical voices that are reaching masses now compared to what was possible even 10 years ago. Again, summarizing, traditional media, people who still depend on the traditional media are going to get the same perspective that they've been getting about the need for the status quo, the stability, and no change, even though they're suffering because of the ownership of the politicians by the, let me rephrase that, because of the connections between these political powers and the economic powers. And they're getting the same voice of that's what is needed for the stability of Puerto Rico, when it may not be necessarily so if there were a different perspective on how much who makes the decisions and how the decisions are made and who benefits from those decisions in government. And that last part, I'll stress this. One of the least things that we hear from any media, except the alternative ones, the critical ones, is who doesn't benefit from the laws that are passed by the powers in government. Who doesn't benefit? How are they getting screwed? Now, you hear that from the alternative media, but you don't hear that. You hardly ever hear that, except in some opinion columns, but you're not going to have a headline, La Ley 22 está fastidiando a miles de personas. You're not going to get that in El Nuevo Día, even though it may be true. So not emphasizing that, you're not going to get that in WAPA, you're not going to get that in WQAQ. I forgot it. Anyway, you're not going to get that from the traditional media, at least not as headlines. You may have a little story, a little passing, hay un problemita. So people who are focused on those traditional media are not going to have the critical mind to think of alternatives for a better future for Puerto Rico, other than continuing what they've had for 20, 30, 40 years.
Well, let me ask, it seems like independent media and these alternative voices are a big part of the the solution to people having a better media diet going forward. We also know that the economic struggles of the media industry is a worldwide problem, right? Does it feel like this is sustainable in Puerto Rico? Given the financial crisis and everything else, for these outlets and these individuals, sometimes it's just one person with their camera and their Facebook, right? Can this survive and thrive in Puerto Rico as an economic model for the media?
They're not going to make profits, major profits or shareholder profits from those alternative media. Es una obra de amor al arte, es una lucha personal. These people are working day and night to get their stories because por amor a Puerto Rico, not because they're thinking, if I get these stories, I'm going to make enhanced profits. And if I suppress these, I'll get more funding from the government for advertisers. You mentioned something that's true worldwide. With the advent of the internet, all traditional media have lost millions and millions, if not billions of dollars from advertising revenues that are now going through social media, the Facebook, the TikTok, whatever has commercial outlets for advertisement is going that way. And the newspapers in particular lost a big revenue from classified advertisements. When you needed to buy something, a car or a fridge, a house, whatever, rent whatever it is, you'd have to go to the classified in the printed newspapers. That's practically gone. Not zero, but it has reduced dramatically all over the world. Now, what do these newspapers do? They provide what they think is the most readable, light stuff, because that will bring enough advertisers different from what the public is going to get from even social media. So that is enough for them to secure their advertising revenues that will maintain them at least at a minimum. But what has gone by the wayside? A lot of the in-depth reporting, the investigative journalism, because those people, to have one story with in-depth analysis of an issue would take a week or two to get their sources and confirm what they're gathering. Now, few of these media can afford to have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 in-depth reporters. They'll have maybe one to take a story once in a while, but not as it used to be in many of these others. And even then, they wouldn't take the most critical ones that would be against the powers in government or economics. So that's a reality being faced by all media, all commercial media. Again, the alternative media are not doing it for profit. They're doing it por amor al arte, por el amor a Puerto Rico, to benefit the need for a positive change, enhancing the knowledge, getting people to see the other sides of the story that are usually not covered in traditional media.
Thank you. I want to turn to a slightly different topic, because I know you're also an expert on U.S. media, or in especially media by and about Latinos in the United States. One of the things we hear most often and have a sense of is that the news in the United States reports very poorly on Puerto Rico, or neglects it entirely. Given your expertise, first of all, is that true, do you think? I see you nodding. And, why? And how do you think it affects both Americans and Puerto Ricans' perceptions of Puerto Rico's status, of what's happening in Puerto Rico, and other issues?
Great question. Here's a little bit of a background. I ended my master's degree at the University of Puerto Rico, one of the first two to get the master's degree at La Escuela de Comunicación at La Universidad de Puerto Rico. And I went to Wisconsin to get my PhD with only one goal in mind: return to Puerto Rico to be a professor in La Escuela. And because I had received 3 years of scholarship from the president's office of the University of Puerto Rico, I thought I'd be going back to Puerto Rico immediately upon graduation and start doing research and teaching about these issues. Well, the government changed from populares to PNPs, and the president of the university at the time that I graduated said, and I was told by a good source, a Federico Subervi no lo vamos a emplear en ninguno de los recintos. He's not going to get any job anywhere in Puerto Rico at the University of Puerto Rico. So I didn't work there, but I did start working at University of California at Santa Barbara, and then University of Texas, and 2 other universities in the US, and then international opportunities that I had. While I was working in US universities, I dedicated many hours and many students' essays to assess how Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans were presented in US news media. And the answer to your question is that there's hardly any coverage unless there's a crisis or something spectacular, because these newspapers and these TV stations will cover what they think is best for the majority of their audiences. Now, in not covering Puerto Rico with all of the nuances and all of the details and the corruption and other things about culture and the positive contribution of Puerto Rico to society in general, those people who don't know anything about Puerto Rico only get the crisis news and the stereotype news. That has a consequence, because they treat us as they see us, well, in news, but even worse so in movies and in TV shows and all of these other stereotype ways where we're hardly existent as contributors to society. Why that is the case is because of the same issue that happens with any media outlet. They're going to have the content that they believe is of most interest to the greater majority of the population, not necessarily as a public service to educate people about Puerto Rico, a colony, its struggles, its benefits. No, there was a crisis. Oh, we had to get a reporter there. There was a hurricane. Yeah, got a reporter there. There was a major corruption. There was an assassination that was beyond scale. There was something. Oh, now we'll cover it. But otherwise, the daily routines are not covered about Puerto Rico or any other country or any other place that's not the editor's perception that is of value for the majority of their particular audiences. Much to my dislike, but that's a reality. Just a few, sometime next week, there'll be a study showing how limited Latino issues are covered in the op-ed pages and the editorial pages of the Los Angeles Times. The Latino Public Policy Institute of the University of California, Santa Barbara is going to release that study. I got a preview of it earlier this week. So there's a limited coverage, even in a city where 50% of the population is probably Latino, or 40%, or a huge percentage of the population is Latino. So the question is, what's the readership of the Los Angeles Times? It's not that 50%, it's whatever smaller percentage of non-Latinos. And that's what they'll have stories, that's what they'll have most of their stories about. Now, the consequences are that those non-Latinos will not learn about the contributions, they'll only learn about the crisis. And that's one of the realities of commercial media, of covering crisis, crime and crisis, of anywhere other than their particular contributions of the people that they think they're catering to most of the time.
Thank you. All right, a couple more questions from me, and then we'll turn it over to some questions from the audience. I know I already saw a couple of things in the chat. Looking forward a little bit, do you expect any of these dynamics to shift or to change substantially in the next few years? There's political realignments happening in Puerto Rico. We have the famous Alianza that is now becoming a more mainstream political force that could perhaps challenge some of these institutional dynamics. You mentioned, of course, the rise of independent media. We see, figures like Sandra Rodriguez Cotto, like Bianca Agralo, who, has a big audience both in Puerto Rico and outside of Puerto Rico. What do you see happening in the next few years? And I'm especially thinking of the 2024 elections and the kind of news media coverage, what that may look like given how things are changing on the electoral front in Puerto Rico.
There are going to be two dynamic lines to pay attention to. One is what the youth are going to be paying attention to through their social media, because they're not going to be reading El Nuevo Dia, and they probably won't be watching much of WAPA News or any other television news, but and they're not going to be reading El Vocero or Metro, even if it's given free on the street. They're not going to be reading those traditional media, but they'll be absorbing a lot of information through their Facebook and through their social media and their chats and their TikTok and whatever. Pay attention to the dynamics of that, but the parallel process in that, in fact, it's going to be three-pronged. One is whatever's going to happen with these youth. But the second one is what's going to go on through the traditional media, because the traditional media reach the people who traditionally vote. middle class. Youth cop out. The unfortunate perspective of too many young people is that it doesn't make a difference. Well, they're wrong. They have been wrong, but they believe it doesn't make a difference because they haven't seen much change. Well, there is a lot of change going on in micro levels, at the micro level, with agriculture, with culture, with environmental issues. If that youth group pays attention to the alternatives and the dynamics of the alternatives, then that second throng of the traditional media will have its effect on the traditional folks, those 40, 50, 60-year-olds who will vote, but paying attention to WAPA, WQAQ, and all of those. And that'll be the main source for them to know what's going on. That's that second throng. But the third line of assessing what may happen in Puerto Rico is what's going to happen with the cyber propaganda, especially with the artificial intelligence that's going to be flooding everything with not just fake news anymore. It's created news, it's created propaganda, taking politicians' views and distorting them purposely and spreading that more than what anybody can control to limit the impact of those. So whatever the youth do through their social media and their own personal contacts, if they get active and they get involved, they'll be bringing some change in some circles. The traditional people will be doing the traditional people, the traditional voting with the traditional media, unless there's some change in those media and those middle class people's perspectives. But the uncertainty, the big question mark for me, is what is going to happen again with that cyber propaganda that's going to be worse than ever in the next few years.
Great. And then one last question from me, and then we'll turn it over to some audience questions I see in the chat. What would you recommend for people who want to improve their media diet, as I said, or their media consumption about Puerto Rico? And I'm thinking especially of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. and Americans in the U.S. who may want to learn more about Puerto Rico from reputable sources, but also people in Puerto Rico who are in the middle of this chaotic and sometimes questionable media landscape, especially from traditional outlets. So whether it's in terms of specific outlets to follow, or just in terms of a specific critical lens to bring to their news consumption, how do we all get better at consuming and finding news about Puerto Rico?
Well, the first thing to do is think and confirm before you push that like or share on anything, because we're in a time of our lives in which, wow, whatever it may be, from culture, from sports, from chismes, whatever, wow, share, like, stop, confirm before you participate, before you are one of these spreaders of what could be disinformation, cyber propaganda. That's the first thing. Number two, get a bit of media literacy. There's media literacy and news literacy courses online now. Learn how to discern between truthful sources and reliable sources and non-truthful sources. And part of that media literacy is to not have a blank statement about the media are, and you've heard me use the media in the plural, the media are. No, the media are not. A particular newspaper for a particular subject may be biased on a particular subject for a particular issue. It will be, because Fox is a right-wing propaganda machine on anything that has to do with Democrats or Republicans. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be a right-wing propaganda machine for news about a beauty pageant, unless one of the contestants is Republican and the other one is Democrat, and then we know what's going to happen, right? Something like that. But it doesn't mean that they're all blank media are whatever. So pay attention to the particular stories and look for alternative views when you hear something that doesn't match what you think should be. That's part of the media literacy. expand your knowledge and understanding why media work as they do and which ones are the most trustworthy. And by expanding that, you have a better sense of what can happen. But I'm going to go back to that first point. Stop sharing things that just seem just inverosímil. It just how could that be? But wow, I wish it were. So yeah, I'm going to share that. Stop doing that. And do that extra, take that extra step to find out more from different sources, even though you may not be comfortable with those different sources. One last thing about this. I was just reading a couple of days ago about a new book and how to change people's minds, or something to the effect of what helps people change, what helps to get people to change their minds. And the first step may be to have them consider that they may change their mind under particular circumstances. So when you have people that are dead stuck on an incorrect point of view, you're not going to change their mind to say, oh, that's wrong. But you can get them to think, what if there are different voices that could tell you a different side of the story? Would you consider? That immediately opens their mind to considering an alternative that may lead to a change of mind for more truthful rather than so echo chamber points of views. Echo chamber meaning you only hear what you want to hear and then the rest of it is not true. So no blank statements about the media are. Check which journalist, story, particular issue, and then make up a bit more of the fact-finding, gathering, knowing how to do that so that you can be more informed and maybe help others be more informed for a better future.
Yeah, I think that's great and important advice for anyone's media consumption, but perhaps especially critical for thinking about and thinking about sharing news in Puerto Rico.
I'm sorry to interrupt because I mentioned something rather quickly in passing. One lesson that all of my students had to learn on critical thinking is when reading stories, well, in fact, it's something that I told them to apply in their daily lives. Try to answer 3 questions. Who makes the decisions that are affecting you? Who? Nombre y apellido. Who? Is it one person? Is it who's that person? Is it a committee? Whatever. In politics, especially, who is making the decisions? Look for that in the news media, in your news stories. Who's making the decision? Number 2, how is that decision made? Is it, again, a conversation? Is it a top-down? Is it bottom up? How are those decisions made? But the third question, which I already mentioned, look for statements on who benefits and who doesn't benefit from those decisions. And see if you're among the beneficiaries, and if you're not even mentioned, why not? Why is it that how come this whole community that is being screwed in terms of the land ownership or in terms of the environmental isn't even mentioned in a news story? Well, then you know that there is a bias or a limitation because the journalist or the news media people don't want you to know that they're getting screwed. So they'll just say, oh, it was so-and-so and this. So they'll give it a light touch. Look for who benefits and who doesn't from these decisions, and then take action to enhance what is known about those issues. That's my suggestion for better news literacy and civic action.
Well, and especially important, I think, in the context of a colonial relationship, where the people and the institutions making the decisions are often, the U.S. government far removed, and it's often hard to glean for the quote unquote regular person, what all the higher power dynamics there are. All right, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that I see in the chat just on behalf of the people who wrote them, but then I'll invite others who may want to ask a question to unmute yourself and do so. And we'll try to get through these quickly so we can get through a couple of them if that's okay in the next 10 minutes. So a question here from Cecilia Ortiz about, again, thinking about these recent crises, the impact of Hurricane Maria. He asks, after a extended period of electricity loss that affected and impacted communications in Puerto Rico, many folks and had to turn to mainland, quote unquote, outlets to get the news. What impact do you think that had in post-hurricane perceptions and attitudes about the recovery of Hurricane Maria, especially? And I think very easy to think of an example. This is me adding this part. Very easy to think of an example like David Begnaud from CBS suddenly becoming the most popular and important reporter in Puerto Rico, someone who probably might have never been to Puerto Rico before Hurricane Maria, and suddenly he's the patron saint of Puerto Rican news. So yeah, how do you think those specific dynamics may have affected things?
I'll say positively, because when you expand your field of knowledge and sources of information, and at least some of that expanded field of knowledge and information news is reliable, you're better off to understand what's going on in any situation, especially in a hurricane. So that's been a positive change. And I think that as long as he's around and there's any other crisis of hurricanes or some other disasters caused by descuido del humano, not nature. Nature doesn't do it. It's the people who don't do the right thing, aware that what nature may bring about. People will be more informed, more accurately informed, better informed, and will not have to rely on the sources that rely on the government, and the government only on what it wants people to know for its benefit. So altogether, this is a positive turn of events. And with social media, with the internet, the thing to be aware of is the created false news, the misinformation, that anytime you see something, look for the source to be sure. If you're not aware of the source, and it comes like an alarm bells and mira esto, Dios mío, ¿qué pasó? Y eso será verdad. Check it out before you believe it, and then check it out certainly before you pass it on.
Great, thank you. A question from Jean. Why do you think there's been so little journalistic scrutiny of the Popular Democratic Party, the PPD's argument that the ELA, the current colonial status, can be improved or enhanced, and related claims like the fact that the recent legislation in Congress, the Puerto Rico Status Act, is unfair because it excludes that option, which I think you've partially answered, talking about the news media's preference for the status quo. But yeah, anything else to say on that? And
Sure.
I would add a sort of related question of how do you think the media coverage has been of the status debate recently, especially in the last couple of years with this legislation?
In the US, nil. The word nil meaning nothing. I mean, you may have had some story here or there, but it's very limited. The stories about Puerto Rico have been about a bit of here corruption, some type of crime issue, whatever it is. So the US public is not going to have these news which they don't see relevant. At least the journalism, the decision makers don't think it's relevant enough to have more than a passing story on occasion about something like that. Now, the limited coverage of the possibilities for the ELA go back to the Supreme Court decisions. The Congress is not going to relinquish its control, its constitutional control over its territories, unless there were a change in the Constitution that says, okay, as of now on, or next week or next month, the Congress will not have powers over its territories. It will be whatever the territories and the president agree on. Congress is not going to change that, and the Supreme Court is not going to change that either. So why beat a dead horse, as the saying goes? And for as much as some people still believe that there is a chance to improve el Estado Libre Asociado, until the Supreme Court and the Constitution and the Congress agree that it's not going to be. It's going to stay as it is for requiem aeterna, as we say in Espanol, or what language that may be. That's probably Latin.
Great, thank you. All right, if anybody else would like to ask a question, please feel free to unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you'd like, introduce yourself, and please ask a brief and respectful question.
Gabriel.
Hi, Federico. It's great to get to talk to you again, even if my camera's not working in Q&A form. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you, BUDPR, for organizing this as well. I'll try to be brief. So I just wanted to ask, basically, there are a lot of Puerto Ricans both in Puerto Rico and in the US. And I wanted to ask what you thought on what you think the relationship is between the audiences that different Puerto Rican media outlets, both in the US and Puerto Rico, have to like the audiences that they speak to, whether you think that having that more US-based audience from the diaspora is going to make a difference in terms of what kinds of content they are going to cover, versus in Puerto Rico, where that's going to be reaching maybe a more local audience, an audience that is going to be have different circumstances and everything, and especially when it comes to alternative media, where they're definitely both focused on, you know, making things better for all Puerto Ricans. You know, how do you think that change in audience has an impact in what is being covered and how to cover it and who it reaches?
I'd be delighted to have students, and I say students because I don't have any other way of, I used to have students to do that, to see, to do a content analysis of how the Orlando Sentinel and how the local television stations in Orlando and even in Miami, or the whole Kissimmee and the whole central Florida region, have presented news about Puerto Rico. Because now those Puerto Ricans who are there may be their critical audiences. Well, they certainly are for advertisers, because this is a very consumerist audience. And chances are that there's going to be a lot more advertisers for advertising from companies, entities, organizations, institutions, whatever, that want that Puerto Rican person, families, whatever, for their income, for their money, for their buying whatever they're selling or promoting. So those newspapers will have to have, the newspapers and the TV stations will certainly have to have a lot more stories that cater to Puerto Ricans in that region. But it's not going to happen in Tallahassee. And it's not going to happen in Boise, Idaho. No matter what, unless there's an earthquake or another hurricane or something major that will be, regardless of Puerto Rico, just because of the nature of the incident, that then will get coverage. It's going to be where the audiences are perceived to be of value for those media outlets, not any other way. Now, from my assessment, and here I do have a bit of research for the Boricua Media Project, is that there are currently no news outlets on radio, and I mentioned television and newspapers, because I don't think that there are many, if any, well, whatever, there's very little, if any, regular newscasts that cater to Puerto Ricanos, the diaspora Puerto Ricanos anywhere in Florida. I don't know that they have regular radio news, but there are some outfits based out of Miami that are creating false news and submitting it as propaganda as if it were true. I'm trying to get to the memory cells that remind me of one particular case in which these right-wing, very conservative, misguided news outlets or radio stations that have news have been stating about many things. I think one of them might have been the vaccine, another one might have been the politicians in Puerto Rico, whatever it is. They are following an ultra right-wing, very conservative, misguided perspective, and the Puerto Rican, let's say even a status quo, a middle ground, ni de derecha ni de izquierda, but just informative news for Puerto Ricans, about Puerto Ricans in the US and in Puerto Rico is still missing for that diaspora. And I would say almost the same thing in New York, although in New York they had El Diario La Prensa for many years. So if you read a newspaper and you wanted to see, you could have at least some news about Puerto Rico from El Diario La Prensa. But you don't have that in Aurora, Illinois. You have some weeklies that are filling their pages with advertising for the products that are needed immediately, the farmacia, the muebleria, the car dealerships, whatever, but not the in-depth stories about who's making decisions that are affecting the Puerto Ricans, how those decisions are affecting. That's missing in Central Florida as it is in Puerto Rico. So there is a gap, there is a need for more of these news sources, better news sources, for the diaspora, anywhere it may be.
All right, I know we're at time, but since we start a couple minutes late, maybe we can quickly take one more question. I do see one here in the chat from Jeremy. Do you think that the government can make, do anything to make journalists and news networks accountable in Puerto Rico for things like fake news or for some of the scandals that we saw, for example, with Sixto George and the real concrete overt manipulation of news media? Is there anything that could be done, whether it's legislation or fines, to get this under control?
I'd rather get the government out of it altogether, honestly, although I wouldn't mind if there was some ethical legislation that could pass muster and be applied. But you can have whatever law you want, and then who's going to enforce it? It's not going to happen, because the first thing is that the news media, anyone, left, right, center, are going to say they're attempting against the freedom of the press. No matter what, it's going to be a challenge to say that's against the freedom of the press. So the only alternatives that I see to that are the public pressure. And if we had some schools of journalism that would do studies and document that and then report on that in their social media and make those journalists, the Sixto George and all of these others, accountable for. Now, accountable for means including pressure against the advertisers, boycotting the advertisers, because advertisers do respond to boycotts. And if you have advertisers supporting these propagandists, these false media, cyber bullying folks, you boycott them, those unethical people will eventually have to be more ethical, just to simplify it.
All right, I want to start wrapping up, but if anybody has a question that they just absolutely positively need to get off their chest, speak
Jeremias
now.
Valle has his hand.
Oh, I think that was a clap, but
Oh, a clap. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, hearing none, and thanks to everyone for engaging in the chat and offering kind words. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank, of course, Dr. Federico Subervi for his really great insights on this topic. His books are the most recent books that much of this conversation is based on are The News Media in Puerto Rico, Journalism in Colonial Settings and in Times of Crises, and then in Spanish, Para entender los medios de comunicación de Puerto Rico, Periodismo en entornos coloniales y tiempos de crisis. Federico, do you want to say briefly where people can find the books?
Yeah, the English language book, you can go to the publisher Routledge, Routledge. If you read Spanish, I really recommend the Spanish language version, because it has a 2-year update after the English language version was done. It has over 100 extra pages, and it's a lot more critical, because I always wanted to write this book in Spanish, but because I was visiting professor at the University of Leeds with a nice fund grant, it was done in English, primarily in Leeds, and that's why it came out like that. But in Spanish, it's a lot better and more updated. It's updated up to August 14, 2022. And that one is available through Librería Laberinto, Librería Norberto, Librería, I'm just forgetting the other ones, almost any librería in Puerto Rico. Oh, Candil in Ponce, Books and Friends in Books and Gifts in Aguadilla. So if you read Spanish, go for the Spanish version. It's less expensive. It's only $19.99. The English language version is twice that much because it's a hardback. The Spanish language version is a paperback.
See, look at that. He's helping us save money too.
Yes.
Very important.
Yeah, and one little thing about that Spanish language book, also the English, but the Spanish language book even more so. To document what we point out in that book, we included 872 sources. That's a bibliography of 872 references. No es cáscara de coco, así que a lot of reading.
Definitely, definitely. Well, thanks again. I hope people will look for the book. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. As I said, this is the first in a series of events that Boricuas Unidos en la Diáspora will be hosting throughout this summer, but later on in the year as well. We look forward to announcing a couple more of those soon. You can always find what we're up to on BUDPR.org or on social media. We are BUDPR. That's BUDPR on Twitter and Facebook, and Bud Puerto Rico on Instagram. Finally, I can't leave without saying, we are an all-volunteer nonprofit organization. We are not well-paid lobbyists like some other folks working on Puerto Rico issues in the United States. That does mean we rely on philanthropic support to do our work. So if you enjoyed today's event, if you want to support more events like this in the future, our continued work in Congress and all our efforts, please consider supporting us with a donation, which you can do at budpr.org/donate. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon or evening, and we hope to see you next time.
Adiós. Buenas noches.